5 real fantastic cases of miraculous survival. In this video, we'll talk about 5 cases where people who survived various disasters or accidents were just incredibly lucky. So grab your popcorn, soda, and get comfortable. It's going to be extremely interesting. Well, I won't keep you waiting any longer. Let's get started. 1. The story of Vesna Vulović. The Guinness Book of World Records has at least one record that is unlikely to be broken by anyone in their right mind. It belongs to Serbian flight attendant Vesna Vulović. In 1972, the girl fell from an altitude of 10,160 meters without a parachute and survived. The uniquely incredible situation was preceded by a chain of fateful coincidences that made it even more unbelievable and even somewhat mystical. Here's a quick chronology of the events in the sky. On January 26, 1972, a McDonnell Douglas DC-9 airliner of Yugoslav Airlines took off from Stockholm and landed in Copenhagen about an hour later. At the Danish airport, the crew was changed. The plane was then supposed to fly to Zagreb and then to Belgrade. The takeoff went completely normally. The plane was brand new and in good working order. The pilots were experienced and well rested. But as soon as the airliner reached an altitude of 10,000 meters, somewhere on the border of Czechoslovakia and East Germany, it suddenly disintegrated. Meanwhile, on the ground, the following was happening. Bruno Honk, a resident of the Czechoslovak village of Srpske Kamenice, was calmly chopping firewood when he suddenly heard an explosion and the sound of falling debris. All the locals had already run out into the street and scattered, trying to find out what had happened. Bruno, not knowing why, rushed into the forest. It was getting dark, and it was difficult to see anything in the dense thicket on the slope of the hill. The man was about to return when he heard a scream. Slipping and struggling to get through the branches of the snowy trees, Honk hobbled towards the sound. Soon he saw part of the fuselage of the plane, which was pressing a girl in a bloodied turquoise uniform to the ground. The 22-year-old girl was diagnosed, in addition to this, with intracranial hemorrhage and pelvic fracture. The doctors predicted that she would not regain consciousness, but a couple of weeks later, the victim was already asking for a cigarette and reading about her story in the newspaper with surprise. Later, the doctors said that the flight attendant would probably not be able to walk, and this prediction did not come true either in 10 months. It's all thanks to a children's diet of chocolate, spinach, and cod liver oil, laughed the girl, whose name, as you've already guessed, was Vesna Vulović. Here, all those who have watched documentaries about air crash investigations have a reasonable question. Why didn't Vulović die of oxygen depressurization at such an altitude? Experts believe it was all due to the girl's low blood pressure. In theory, it should have saved her a year earlier. With such features of the body, they usually don't take flight attendants. But Vesna wanted to fly so much that she deceived the commission, drinking coffee before the medical examination. Thanks to the amnesia, by the way, Vulović did not develop a fear of flying, did not lose her passion for flights, and even wanted to return to work as a flight attendant. But this time, she would definitely not be able to deceive the medical commission. The airline offered the girl only a managerial position on the ground. So what actually happened to that ill-fated flight? It seems that the responsibility for the explosion of the plane was claimed by the far-right organization Ustashi, which fought for the independence of Croatia in the 1970s. But there were also investigations stating that the airliner was shot down by the Czechoslovak Air Force. There were rumors that Vulović's miraculous survival was part of some undercover cover-up operations, and that her fall was not from such a great height. Vesna herself did not comment on conspiracy theories. After being fired and until her death in 2016, the woman mostly lived as a recluse in her Belgrade apartment and only occasionally went to Srpske Kamenice for memorial events. 2. The story of Alcides. 3. The story of Arthur Priest. On the night of April 14th, 1912, the most famous maritime disaster in human history was unfolding in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The Titanic was sinking. The 712 survivors, out of more than 2,000 on board, sitting in the evacuation boats, were unlikely to think of anything other than the soonest arrival on the shore, where they could warm up and recover from the shock. Except perhaps for one, Arthur Priest, who worked as a stoker on the Titanic. The man could well, while rubbing his frostbitten toes, plan to buy a pack of lottery tickets and burn his work record book upon his return home. The fact is that the wreck of the ill-fated ship was already the third in the life of the 24-year-old Priest, and spoiler, by no means the last. And in 1908, he was hired to shovel coal into the furnaces of the new mail steamship, Asturias. The debut voyage of this vessel ended with a hole in the side. The versions of what happened differ. According to one, it collided with some underwater obstacle. According to another, it did not part with another ship. The crew managed to return the Asturias to the port, so no one was even injured. Nevertheless, it was approximately at that moment that the universe began its game with Arthur Priest. 3 years later, Priest gets a job on the crew of the liner Olympic, the elder brother of the Titanic, who shared with him, and later with the Britannic, the title of the largest ship of its time. One of the routine autumn voyages was overshadowed by the sound of crumpled metal. The Olympic rammed the British armored deck cruiser Hawke. Due to the fact that the warship came too close to the passenger ship, the vessels stuck to each other, and then the Hawke inadvertently fulfilled its combat mission and made 2 holes in the liner's hull. Again, no casualties, and our stoker safely ignored the second yellow card from fate. In 1912, Arthur, an experienced coal shoveler, was poached into the black team of the Titanic. This is what they called a team of 176 people who shoveled 600 tons of coal into the liner's furnaces every day, while at the same time throwing 100 tons of ash into the ocean. The working conditions, as one might guess, were not the best. They say be grateful that you were taken here at all, given the endless strikes of coal workers. To go and take a nap in the cabin is an exceptional luxury. Instead of overalls, due to the terrific heat, only a cotton vest and shorts. So when Priest's next workplace crashed into an iceberg, he had to get out of the lower deck of the liner, through the boiler room labyrinths, half asleep and practically naked. When the sinking Titanic's upper deck emerged from the water, Arthur was already there, at a time when the deck was almost not visible above the water surface, and all the lifeboats had long since left. There was no way out. The stoker jumps into the ocean and manages to hold out in the icy water for a couple of hours until rescue arrives. At the same time, most of those who followed his example died of frostbite. In the same 1916, the man decided either to challenge the heavens or to collect the perfect survival combo, and went to work on the Britannic. Yes, the same one from the famous transatlantic trio. The youngest of the liners does not have time to make a single civilian voyage. Immediately after being launched, it is converted into a floating military hospital. When the Britannic is blown up by a German mine, Priest's muscles do not tremble at all. The stoker repeats his rescue plan, honed on the Titanic. This time Arthur found himself in the water too quickly. The sinking Britannic's engines were still running, rapidly sucking into the spinning propellers all those who were unlucky enough to be nearby. In a letter to his relatives, the coal worker described this moment as follows. A piece of the boat rammed into me and pushed me right under the blades. I started spinning like a top, closed my eyes and said goodbye to this world. But it all ended just in time, when I was already ready for the worst. Someone from above still fought and pushed away the debris. One poor guy started drowning and grabbed me, but I had to shake him off. Then 30 people died under the propellers. Arthur was one of the 2 survivors. 1917. Priest's new place of service is the ferry Donegal, transporting wounded British soldiers from Europe to the foggy Albion. This ship perishes in the middle of the English Channel after being hit by a German torpedo. The unsinkable stoker is saved again, although this time he receives the most serious injury. During the evacuation dash through the boiler room, a large piece of debris hits Arthur in the head. Be that as it may, the wolf ticket buried Priest's maritime career. What he did for the next 20 years on land, history is silent about, but they said that the unsinkable stoker could often be found in the pubs of his native Southampton, where he happily told tales about his eventful shipboard life. Arthur died at the age of 49 from a simple pneumonia, surrounded by his wife and 3 children, and with the combat medal, Merchant Navy ribbon, on his chest. 4. Frane Selak's story. Frane Selak's life is like the plot of a Hollywood blockbuster. He managed to come out alive from deadly situations multiple times. No one dares to explain this phenomenon yet. Born in 1929 in Croatia, Frane Selak lived a normal life as a music teacher until the age of 33. But after that, incredible things started happening to him one after another, which cannot be explained scientifically. Perhaps there is no other person in the world who has survived so many transportation disasters. Many would have been enough with just one, but Frane survived 7. Let's tell about these events in order. 1962, train crash. In the winter of 1962, Frane was traveling by train which derailed and fell into a river. 17 people died that day. They froze and drowned in the cold water. Frane only got a broken arm. 1963, plane crash. A year later, Frane was once again on the verge of death. For the first time in his life, the Croat was flying by plane. This first impressive experience ended in tragedy for everyone on board, except Frane. Due to a technical malfunction, the cabin depressurized. The aircraft crashed to the ground, taking the lives of all passengers and crew. Frane jumped out of the plane and fell on a haystack. That saved him. 1966, bus plunged into a river. 3 years later, another disaster. Frane was traveling by bus when it skidded on the icy road. The driver lost control, and the bus slid down the hill on its side and fell into the river. The Croat was unharmed. 1970, car accident. By the early 70s, Frane already had 3 disasters behind him, but the brave Croat did not hesitate to get behind the wheel. While driving, the engine in his car caught fire. Frane braked and jumped out of the cabin just seconds before the explosion. 1973, another car accident. Despite all he had been through, Frane bought another car. Incredibly, 3 years later, the situation was repeated with jewel-like precision. A fire broke out in the car again, and Frane managed to jump out again. He remained unscathed, though he singed his hair a bit. After this incident, Frane's friends refused to ride with him in the same car. Many turned away from him, believing that communicating with the man could bring misfortune. Now even Frane himself did not know what to call himself, the luckiest or the most unlucky person on the planet. 1995, and again a bus. In 1995 in Zagreb, a bus hit the Croat. This time he received serious injuries, but survived, which, given the severity of the incident, was also a miracle. 1996, fell off a cliff. In 1996, Frane's car collided with a truck. From the impact, his car was thrown to the edge of the cliff. It flew about 100 meters down and landed on a tree that cushioned the fall and saved the Croat's life. 2003, lottery. For almost 7 years after the 1996 car accident, Frane lived peacefully. But fate, which had saved his life 7 times, did not forget about him. And 2 days before his 73rd birthday, it made the Croat an incredible gift, a lottery win of $1 million. With this money, the man bought a house and a new car, but in 2010, he somehow refused his wealth. He transferred his property to friends and relatives, and he himself returned to his old modest cottage, where he still lives with his 5th wife. Do you see anything mystical in Frane Selak's fate? I don't even know what to say. 5. The story of the Andes disaster. To conclude the collection, I would like to tell the heart-wrenching story of a group of surviving rugby players. Almost 50 years ago, an air disaster occurred over the Andes. A passenger plane crashed into an unnamed peak and plummeted down. The whole world considered it a terrible tragedy that claimed the lives of all the passengers. However, it later turned out that most of them had survived. For the sake of survival, they went against their own moral principles, endured the test of hunger and cold, fought the elements, and not everyone emerged victorious from the struggle with death. The last flight, the Fairchild FH-227D aircraft, was chartered by the amateur rugby team Old Christians. The athletes were heading to Santiago. There a match against the English club Old Boys was supposed to take place. On board were 19 team members, their family members, friends and fans, a total of 40 people, whose flight was provided by a crew of 5. The route lay through the Andes. The plane took off from Montevideo on October 12, 1972, but everything immediately went wrong. Due to a storm front over the mountain range, the crew made an emergency landing in the Argentine Mendoza. Since the cyclone did not subside, they spent the night there. The flight was allowed to depart only the next day at 2:18 p.m. They were essentially flying around, as the weather conditions were still leaving much to be desired. Over the radio, the pilot reported to the airport controllers in Malargüe that he would reach the Planchon Pass by 3:21 p.m. There they could set a course for the city of Curico and begin the descent towards Santiago. Due to an error in the calculations, the crew requested descent earlier than they should have. It was later found that the pilot did not take into account the strong headwind, which significantly slowed down the plane. As a result, the airliner got caught in the cyclone, and the pilot had to fly the plane blind. Collision with the rock was inevitable. About 90 minutes into the flight, we hit an air pocket, then another, even deeper, and I heard the pilot yell, "Give me strength." I felt the plane was on a steep slope, and we were heading straight for the mountain. Then there was a loud crack. The wing hit the rock. I squeezed my head between my legs and closed my eyes, convinced that I would die at the age of 24. José Luis Inciart, passenger. The plane crashed into the mountain, immediately losing both wings and the tail section. The remaining part of the fuselage plummeted onto the glacier from a height of 725 meters. As a result of the crash, more than a dozen passengers were killed. Several people fell out of the cabin at the moment of the first impact. Another 5 immediately after the fall. 27 people survived until the next morning, but the injuries were fatal for several passengers and 1 crew member. 24 people miraculously remained virtually unharmed. The passengers were absolutely confident that they would be quickly found, but this did not happen. The problem was that no one knew the exact route of the airliner, since even the pilot himself provided the controller with incorrect information during the descent. And it was almost impossible to see the crash site from the air. The white plane blended in with the glacier. Nearly 36 people found themselves cut off from the world without food, water, and warm clothes, and moreover at a great height where the oxygen level is lower than usual, and breathing is very difficult. The rugby team's doctor died in the crash, so his duties fell to non-professionals, 2 rugby players who were first-year medical students. They organized an improvised first aid station and made homemade splints and casts for their comrades, using the wreckage of the plane. Terrible decisions. To survive, the survivors had to eat the bodies of their deceased companions. Almost everyone who was on the plane were devout Catholics and found this idea revolting. But there was no other way to survive the hunger. As one of the passengers eventually admitted, for the sake of saving the others, he himself would willingly have given his body to be eaten in case of death. Eating human flesh is not easy, José Luis Inciarte recounted. The mind has to force the body to do it. I couldn't open my mouth, and then I had to force myself to swallow with difficulty. The decision to eat the dead will be the last decisive step in our transformation, the last farewell to innocence. We were pushing the boundaries of our fear. I knew that protein would help us survive, and I also knew that if we delayed our decision a little longer, we would become too weak and unable to recover from the hunger. We could not wait forever, otherwise the changes in the body would become irreversible. Roberto Canessa, excerpt from the book I Had to Survive. The survivors understood that there was no help to wait for. They would have to save themselves. But 16 days after the disaster, the elements once again destroyed their plans. While the survivors were sleeping, an avalanche came down from the mountains and buried them in the fuselage of the plane. The living were locked in a snowy prison, mixed with the corpses. To get out, they had to dig a tunnel to the cockpit and kick out the glass in the cockpit. This incident severely undermined the health and morale of those who remained alive. However, according to Inciarte, they cared for each other very much. His leg became inflamed, he suffered from severe pain, and lost 45 kilograms in just a few weeks. But his friends were always there and made sure he drank enough water and did not forget to eat. The avalanche insulated the fuselage and protected their temporary shelter from the cold winds, and the bodies of their deceased comrades helped them last for another month. The survivors began to prepare a new expedition. Throughout November, 3 chosen ones received more food to gain strength before the hike. Thanks to the first unsuccessful sortie, they knew they couldn't do without sleeping bags. They managed to sew them from the remnants of clothing. The path to salvation. On December 12th, Nando Parado, Antonio Vizintin and Roberto Canessa set out towards Chile to inform the world about the surviving passengers of the Fairchild FH. 227D and ask for help. 2 days later, Visintin had to return, but Parado and Canessa, despite illnesses and difficulties, still reached the populated areas. On the 9th day of the journey, they met a local resident, Sergio Catalan, who informed the authorities about the group of survivors after the disaster. José Luis Inciarte remained in the camp and did not know that help was already close. Later, he said that he had decided to die if they were not rescued before Catholic Christmas. The rescuers arrived on December 22nd. The survivors were evacuated by helicopters for 2 days. It couldn't be done faster due to bad weather conditions. All the rescued, suffering from altitude sickness, malnutrition, dehydration, and frostbite, received medical assistance. The attitude towards the survivors was ambiguous. A few days after the rescue, local newspapers began to write about what exactly the survivors had eaten and how they had made a deal with their conscience. Later, a cross was installed at the crash site and the bodies of the deceased were buried. The survivors told in detail about what had happened at a press conference and later wrote several books about it. In addition, several films were made about their lives and rescue. They are all engaged in public activities, supporting fellow citizens in difficult situations. For example, in 2010, they supported Chilean miners trapped underground as a result of an accident. And a year earlier, it became known that all 16 survivors of that flight decided to support the organ donation program. According to them, they once made a contract with life, and the citizens of Uruguay should also participate in the state organ donation program. Well, that's all. I would like to hear your comments. What do you think about all these events that have occurred, and do you believe in miracles? Also, subscribe to my channel if you like the collection, and don't forget to like this video so that I understand that you liked my work. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next videos.